Hey there, welcome to Shadow Archives. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy true horror and unsettling stories. One of the most unsettling experiences of my life happened during a period when my husband and I were renting an old condo in Phoenix. I've had nightmares before like anyone else, but those fade away once you wake up. This was different because it was something that happened over and over again while I was fully awake. For several months, that condo became a place where I constantly felt uneasy, like something was just slightly wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The building itself looked ordinary from the outside, but inside it had that unmistakable feeling of age. The stairs creaked when you stepped on them. The wallpaper had patterns that looked like they had been there for decades, and the cupboards made hollow noises when you opened and closed them. None of those things were unusual for an older place, but together they gave the condo a strange atmosphere. It always felt a little darker and quieter than it should have. When we first moved in, the first week was completely normal. The unfamiliarity of the new place made me feel slightly uneasy, but that's a pretty common reaction when you're adjusting to a new home. Every house has its own sounds and rhythms, and sometimes it takes a while to get used to them. At first, I assumed that was all I was feeling, but after that first week, something began happening that quickly turned my mild discomfort into real fear. Every single night, after we had gone to bed and the house was quiet, I would hear footsteps on the stairs. Our condo had a staircase that led up to the second floor, and our bedroom was the first room at the top of those stairs. The stairs themselves were old wood, so whenever someone stepped on them, they made a very distinctive creaking sound. The footsteps always followed the same pattern. First, there would be the sound of someone stepping onto the bottom of the stairs, then another step, then another. Slowly, one step at a time, the creaks would move upward. Each night, the footsteps would climb the entire staircase, and then they would stop, right outside our bedroom door. That was the part that terrified me the most. The sound never continued past that point. It never went down the hallway or into another room. It always ended at the door. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just the house settling or some kind of normal noise caused by the building shifting during the night. Older buildings make strange sounds sometimes, especially when temperatures change. But the sounds were too clear and too consistent. It always sounded like someone walking. I told my husband about it after the first few nights. He didn't take it seriously. He thought I was just hearing normal house noises and interpreting them as footsteps because the place was new and unfamiliar. He told me I was probably just imagining it. I tried to believe him, but the sounds kept happening. Every night I found myself lying awake in bed, waiting for them. Eventually, the anticipation itself became exhausting. I knew that sometime during the night I would hear those footsteps again. They would start at the bottom of the stairs, slowly climb upward, and then stop outside the door. Night after night, the pattern repeated. My imagination started filling in the worst possible explanations. I would lie there staring at the door, convinced that one night the footsteps wouldn't stop outside. One night they would continue. The door would open, and whatever was making those sounds would come inside. I told my mother about the situation during a phone call one day. I explained how the footsteps were happening every night and how uncomfortable the place made me feel. She listened patiently, and when she came to visit, she brought me something small that she thought might help me feel safer. It was a clatter ring made from malachite. She told me that some people believed malachite could ward off negative energy or evil influences. Whether or not that belief had any real basis didn't really matter to me at the time. Just having something that felt protective gave me a small sense of comfort. Whenever I was home alone, I would wear that ring. It made me feel calmer, like I had some small shield against whatever strange feeling lingered in that condo. One afternoon, though, something happened that completely shattered that sense of comfort. I was getting ready to take a shower. Before stepping into the bathroom, I removed the ring from my finger and placed it on top of the television in the bedroom. Our TV was one of those large projection screen models that were popular at the time, and the flat surface on top made a convenient place to set things down. I placed the ring there without thinking much about it. Then I went to take my shower. The shower probably lasted about 15 minutes. When I finished, I got dressed and walked back into the bedroom. The first thing I noticed was that the ring was gone. At first, I thought I must have misplaced it. Maybe I had set it somewhere else without remembering, but when I checked the TV, the ring wasn't there. I began searching the immediate area, thinking that maybe one of my dogs had accidentally knocked it off while jumping onto the bed. We had large dogs at the time, so that explanation seemed possible. I checked the floor around the TV. Nothing. I moved the blankets on the bed. Nothing. I checked the dresser, the nightstand, and every nearby surface. Still nothing. What started as a simple search quickly turned into a frantic one. I spent nearly an hour looking through the entire bedroom. I checked corners, lifted furniture slightly, and even looked in places where the ring logically couldn't have reached. The more I searched, the more anxious I became. Eventually, the frustration and fear overwhelmed me. I sat down on the floor and started crying. The ring had meant something to me, not just because it was a gift from my mother, but because it had become a kind of emotional protection against the fear I felt in that condo. After a few minutes, I pulled myself together enough to call my mom and tell her what had happened. While I was on the phone with her explaining how the ring had disappeared, I turned around toward the television. What I saw made my entire body go cold. The ring was sitting exactly where I had placed it earlier, right on top of the TV, in the exact same spot. For a moment, I couldn't even move. I had searched that area repeatedly. There was no way I could have missed it. Slowly, almost in disbelief, I stood up and walked toward the TV. My hands were shaking as I picked up the ring. The moment I slid it back onto my finger, something else happened. From upstairs, I heard a loud crash. The toilet seat had slammed down violently, not a gentle closing sound, a hard, sudden slam. The noise echoed through the house so loudly that it made me jump. At that moment, the fear I had been holding inside for weeks finally broke loose completely. I stood there frozen, listening for any other sound. But the house went silent again. After that incident, the atmosphere in the condo felt even worse. We wanted to move, but breaking the lease would have been financially impossible at the time. We simply didn't have the money to leave right away. For a while, things seemed calmer. The footsteps continued most nights, but nothing else dramatic happened. Then one night, my sister came to visit. She stayed over at the condo, and we spent the evening watching movies and eating snacks. Having someone else in the house made the place feel less intimidating, and for a while, I forgot about the strange experiences. It was late when I finally got up to go to the bathroom. The bathroom was upstairs, so I started walking toward the staircase. As I reached the middle of the stairs, something happened that I will never forget. I suddenly heard a voice right next to my ear. It said two words, "Fucking slut." The words were loud and clear, but what made the experience even more terrifying was the physical sensation that came with it. I felt breath against my face. It was as if someone had leaned directly beside me and whispered those words harshly into my ear. The shock of it made me scream immediately. My legs gave out beneath me and I collapsed onto the stairs. My sister ran over thinking I had slipped and fallen. She kept asking what happened, but I was too shaken to answer clearly at first. Part of me tried to convince myself that the sound had come from the television downstairs. So I asked her if anyone on the TV had just said something like that. She looked confused and said no. Nothing like that had been said on the television, and even if it had been, it wouldn't explain the feeling of someone's breath on my face. After that night, living in that condo became unbearable. I constantly felt watched. Every noise made me nervous. I began feeling depressed and paranoid, like the house itself was pressing down on me. Eventually, we were able to move out. The moment we left that place, the tension that had followed me for months seemed to disappear. Life slowly returned to normal. To this day, I never found any explanation for what happened in that condo. I even tried looking into records or local stories about the building, hoping to find some clue about past events there. But I never found anything. All I know is that leaving that place was one of the greatest reliefs I have ever felt. When I think back on some of the strangest and most frightening moments from when I was younger, two experiences stand out very clearly. Neither of them involved anything supernatural in the end, but at the time they felt absolutely terrifying. The strange part about fear is that it doesn't always come from real danger. Sometimes it comes from confusion, exhaustion, imagination, or the way our brains react to unfamiliar situations. The first experience happened one night when I decided to take melatonin before going to sleep. I had been having trouble falling asleep for a while, and someone suggested that melatonin might help. It's a supplement many people take because it helps regulate sleep, and usually it works pretty gently. But that night I must have taken more than I should have. I didn't realize it right away. When I first went to bed, everything seemed normal. I lay there in the dark, waiting for sleep to come the way it usually does. The house was quiet, and nothing seemed unusual. Eventually, I drifted off. At some point later during the night, though, I woke up suddenly. The room was dark and silent, just the way it usually is in the middle of the night. For a moment, I thought I had simply woken up normally. But then I noticed something that made my heart start beating faster. At the foot of my bed, standing near my feet, was a small figure. It looked short and hunched, wearing something that resembled a hooded cloak or robe. The shape was mostly a dark silhouette against the dim light of the room. At first, my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. I remember thinking, very clearly, "Shh, what is that?" My brain tried to come up with logical explanations. Maybe it was a shadow from something in the room. Maybe I was still half asleep and my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the figure didn't disappear. It stayed there, standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. The longer I stared at it, the more real it seemed. Then suddenly, without warning, the figure moved. It reached forward and grabbed my feet from under the blankets. The sensation felt incredibly real. I felt the pressure of its hands around my ankles as it began pulling me toward the edge of the bed. At first, I was too shocked to react. I lay there frozen, watching the room shift slowly as my body was dragged closer and closer to the edge. The feeling was so vivid that it felt like it was actually happening. As the creature's grip tightened around my feet, I felt a sharp pressure spreading through my legs. In my mind, it felt like the bones in my feet were cracking under the strength of the grip. At the same time, a strange, high-pitched sound filled the room. It started quietly at first, almost like a distant ringing, but it quickly grew louder and louder until it felt like it was drilling directly into my ears. The whole situation felt impossible. My thoughts raced as I tried to understand what was happening. "This can't be real," I kept telling myself over and over again. "This can't be happening." But the creature kept pulling. My body slid farther toward the edge of the bed. I imagined it dragging me down into the darkness below, into some unknown place where I would disappear completely. The screeching sound kept growing louder, filling the entire room with a piercing noise that made it hard to think. The moment felt endless, but just as the creature seemed about to pull me completely off the bed, I woke up. The room snapped back into normal reality. I was still lying in my bed exactly where I had been before. My feet were still under the blankets. There was no creature, no screeching noise, nothing. I sat there for several seconds trying to catch my breath. My heart was pounding hard in my chest, and my entire body felt tense. Slowly, it became clear that what I had experienced had been some kind of hallucination or extremely vivid dream caused by the melatonin. Even though I knew that logically, the memory of how real it had felt stayed with me for a long time. It was one of those dreams that feels so physical and convincing that your brain struggles to fully accept that it never actually happened. The second experience happened years earlier when I was around 12 years old. This one started much more quietly, but at the time it scared me just as much. It was late at night, well after everyone else in the house had gone to sleep. I woke up needing to brush my teeth before going back to bed. The house was completely dark and silent, the kind of quiet that only happens in the middle of the night when everyone is asleep. As I walked down the hallway toward the bathroom, I passed by a window that looked out into the backyard. Something outside caught my attention. Through the glass, I saw a small shape move across the yard. It looked like a small animal, but in the dim lighting, it was hard to tell exactly what it was. The shape was low to the ground and moved quickly across the window's view before disappearing into the darkness. Seeing something move outside in the middle of the night immediately made me uneasy, but I tried to convince myself that it was probably just a normal animal passing through the yard, maybe a stray cat, maybe a raccoon, maybe something else harmless. Trying to ignore the uneasy feeling, I continued into the bathroom. I turned on the light and began brushing my teeth. For a few moments, everything seemed normal again. Then suddenly I heard a loud scratching sound. It came from the bathroom window. At first it was just a light scraping noise against the screen. Then it became much louder. Something was clawing at the window screen from the outside. The sound was frantic and aggressive, like whatever was outside was desperately trying to tear its way through. The noise echoed through the quiet bathroom, making my heart race instantly. In my 12-year-old mind, the situation became terrifying almost immediately. My imagination ran wild with possibilities. I pictured some strange creature outside the window trying to break in. The scratching sounds grew louder and more intense, like sharp claws ripping across the metal mesh of the screen. I froze for a second, toothbrush still in my hand. Then panic took over. I ran out of the bathroom as fast as I possibly could. At the time, it felt like I moved so quickly that I might as well have teleported down the hallway. My heart was pounding, and I didn't stop running until I reached the safer part of the house. For several minutes, I stayed there trying to calm myself down. Eventually, curiosity started to push back against my fear. I needed to know what had made that noise. After building up enough courage, I slowly approached the back door that led to the backyard. I opened it cautiously and looked outside. For a moment, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed movement near the door. Out of the darkness came a familiar shape. It was my cat. He casually walked through the doorway and into the house like nothing unusual had happened. The mystery was solved instantly. My cat had been outside and wanted to come back in. The scratching I heard had simply been him, clawing at the bathroom window screen, trying to get someone's attention. All that terror had been caused by a very normal situation. Still, the memory of how frightened I had been stayed with me. Even now, when I think back on those two experiences, the hallucination with the hooded figure and the scratching at the bathroom window, they still give me a small chill. Not because they were supernatural or dangerous, but because of how real fear can feel when your mind fills in the unknown with something much darker than reality. When I was in college near the end of my senior year, I was living in a rented house with a couple of other people. Like many college students, we had found a place that wasn't fancy, but was good enough for a temporary home while we finished school. The house had several bedrooms, a shared kitchen, a living room, and a long hallway that connected everything together. It was one of those older student houses that had probably been rented to generations of students before us. The floors creaked a little, the walls were thin, and there were always random sounds at night as the house settled. At the time, I was preparing to graduate, which meant my life was in the middle of a big transition. I was packing things up slowly whenever I had free time, because I knew I would be moving soon after finishing school. Because of that, my room was full of boxes, cardboard boxes stacked along the walls, some filled with books, others with clothes, and a few with random items that had accumulated over the years. The room looked more like a storage space than a bedroom by that point. I also had a cat living with me in the house. She was small, curious, and constantly exploring things she probably shouldn't have been touching. Anyone who has owned a cat knows they have a habit of climbing onto shelves, jumping onto boxes, and knocking things over for no apparent reason. Because of that, it wasn't unusual to hear small noises during the night, something falling off a table or a box shifting slightly when she jumped onto it. One particular night stands out in my memory more clearly than almost any other. My roommates happened to be away that evening. I don't remember exactly where they had gone, but I knew I would be the only one staying in the house that night. That didn't bother me at all at the time. I had spent plenty of nights alone there before, and the house usually felt quiet and peaceful when everyone else was gone. That evening, I went through my usual routine. I spent some time in my room, maybe watching something on my computer or organizing a few things in boxes. Eventually, I turned off the lights and went to bed. The house was completely silent once I fell asleep. Sometime later during the night, though, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know what had woken me. When you wake up in the middle of the night, it often takes a moment for your brain to reconnect with the surroundings. Then I heard a sound. It was a thump. Not a loud crash, but the unmistakable sound of something bumping into one of the boxes in my room. Because I had so many boxes stacked around the room, that kind of noise didn't seem unusual at first. My immediate thought was that my cat must have been climbing around and knocked something over or jumped onto one of the boxes. Still half asleep, I barely opened my eyes. The room was dark and quiet again. I assumed it was nothing serious, so I closed my eyes again and started drifting back towards sleep. Then I felt something on the bed. It was the sensation of movement on the mattress beside me, like my cat jumping up and walking across the blankets. Again, that was something that happened all the time. My cat liked to sleep near me or occasionally climb across the bed in the middle of the night. I barely reacted at first, but then something felt wrong. The weight on the bed kept moving closer. At first, it felt like the familiar light pressure of a small animal stepping onto the mattress. But as the weight shifted toward my body, it felt heavier than it should have been. Much heavier. The thought passed through my mind slowly, like my brain was struggling to process it. This is too heavy to be my cat. The pressure on the bed continued moving. I could feel something crawling across the mattress toward me. Now I was fully awake. Slowly I opened my eyes. For a moment I couldn't understand what I was seeing. There was an arm lying across my body, a human arm. My brain tried to reject that information immediately. It didn't make sense, but the arm was there. I could see it clearly even in the dim light of the room. My heart started racing, slowly, almost mechanically. I turned my head to look upward. That's when I saw the face. Someone was leaning over me, a face staring directly down at mine. For a moment, time seemed to stop completely. Everything in my body should have reacted instantly. Most people would scream or jump out of bed. But something strange happened instead. My fight-or-flight instinct completely failed. Instead of panic, I felt a strange kind of disbelief. My mind couldn't fully accept what I was seeing. So the only thing I managed to say was something simple and confused. "What the hell? Who are you?" The words came out almost calmly, like I was asking a normal question rather than confronting a stranger in my bedroom. The person didn't respond. There was no explanation, no sudden movement. The person simply stood up, calmly, slowly, then turned and walked toward my bedroom door. Now I watched them cross the room without saying anything. They opened the door and walked out into the hallway, and then they were gone. For a few seconds, I remained frozen in bed. My brain was struggling to catch up with what had just happened. Eventually, the shock broke and panic rushed in. I jumped out of bed and grabbed my phone. The house was completely silent again. I called the police and explained that someone had been in my bedroom. They arrived not long afterward and searched the house carefully. They checked every room, every closet, and the doors and windows to see how someone might have gotten inside. But they didn't find anyone. There was no sign of forced entry, no open windows, no broken locks. Nothing that explained how someone could have entered the house and then disappeared. Eventually, the officers told me they couldn't determine how anyone could have gotten in or out. They suggested that maybe someone had slipped out before they arrived. But even that explanation didn't feel satisfying. Over time, I told the story to a few people, and some of them suggested that maybe it had just been a nightmare, but I know it wasn't a dream. There is one simple reason for that. After the person walked out of my room, I had to get out of bed and close the bedroom door. I always slept with the door closed. That night, it had been opened when the person left. I remember walking across the room and shutting it myself after calling the police. If it had been a dream, the door would never have been open. Even now, years later, I still don't know what actually happened that night. Maybe it really was a strange intruder who somehow entered and escaped without leaving any trace. Maybe someone had been hiding somewhere in the house. Or maybe it was something I'll never fully understand. All I know is that after that night, I never slept in that room again. One of the strangest and most unsettling stories I've ever heard didn't happen to me directly. It happened to my dad many years ago, long before I was old enough to really understand what he was describing. Over time, he told the story a few times, and every time he talked about it, you could see that it still made him uncomfortable. Even years later, something about that night clearly stayed with him. At the time this happened, my dad was living in a small house with my stepmom. Their life together was fairly normal. They both worked regular jobs, kept a routine, and like most people, they ended their evenings by going to bed and trying to get enough sleep before the next day started. The house they lived in wasn't particularly old or unusual. It was a fairly standard home in a quiet neighborhood. There were no strange stories connected to it and no history that anyone knew about. As far as anyone could tell, it was just another place to live. One night, though, something happened that neither of them ever managed to fully explain. My dad had gone to sleep like he normally did. Nothing unusual had happened that evening. They had probably watched some television, talked for a while, and then turned out the lights for the night. Sometime during the night, he started dreaming. In the dream, he found himself lying in the same bed where he was sleeping in real life. But the situation felt very different from reality. In the dream, he was completely alone. He described it as feeling incredibly vulnerable. In the dream, he was naked, curled up tightly in the fetal position in the middle of the bed. Everything around him felt dark and empty, as if the room itself had become larger and colder. He said the dream had a heavy emotional feeling to it. There was a strong sense of fear that he couldn't quite explain. It was the kind of fear that seems to come from nowhere but still feels overwhelming. In the dream, he began rocking back and forth slowly. As he rocked, he kept repeating the same words over and over again. He was saying, "Please, God, just get it away from me. Please just make it go away." He said the words kept coming out of his mouth almost automatically, like he was begging for help from something he couldn't see. But the strange thing about the dream was that he never actually saw what he was afraid of. There was no visible monster, no figure standing in front of him, no clear threat, just an overwhelming feeling that something terrible was there. It was something that he desperately wanted to disappear. The dream continued like that for what felt like a long time. In dreams, time often behaves strangely. A moment can feel like minutes or even hours. Eventually, my dad woke up. When he opened his eyes, he realized he was back in the real bedroom. He was lying in the bed next to my stepmom, exactly where he had fallen asleep earlier. For a few seconds, he just lay there quietly, trying to shake off the strange dream. His first thought was confusion. He remembered the words he had been saying in the dream. "Please God, just get it away from me." But now that he was awake, he had no idea what it had been. He remembered thinking to himself, "Get what away from me?" The room was dark and silent. Everything seemed normal again. Then something happened that immediately erased any sense of calm. And from somewhere behind him, near the head of the bed, he heard a voice. He later described the voice as the darkest and deepest voice he had ever heard in his life. It didn't sound like a normal human voice. It had a low, heavy tone that seemed to fill the room. The voice slowly spoke a single word. It stretched the word out in a slow, drawn-out way. "Good." Then it continued with a question. "Who are you to say that God is real?" My dad said the moment he heard that voice, his entire body froze. The fear that had existed in his dream suddenly returned. But now he was fully awake. He didn't move. He didn't turn around. He didn't speak. He just lay there completely still. His mind raced with questions. Had the voice come from inside his dream and somehow continued into the real world? Had he imagined it? Had someone actually spoken those words in the room? But there was no one else there. The house was quiet, and the voice had come from directly behind him, near the back of the bed. He later said that the tone of the voice was something he would never forget. It sounded almost like it came from a deep, echoing space, like a cavern or something hollow. The words themselves were simple, but the way they were spoken made them feel threatening. He said he was too afraid to turn around and look. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, staring into the darkness of the room. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Nothing else happened, but he couldn't bring himself to move. He simply lay there, waiting. Eventually, the long night began to fade into early morning. The faint light of sunrise slowly started to filter through the windows. Only when the room began to brighten did he finally feel safe enough to relax. Morning arrived and the normal routine of the day began. My stepmom got up and went into the kitchen to start preparing breakfast. My dad eventually got out of bed and sat down at the kitchen table. But the events of the night were still fresh in his mind. He wasn't sure whether what he had experienced was real or some strange extension of his dream. Part of him wondered if his mind had created the voice as he woke up. Another part of him feared that something else had happened. He decided to ask my stepmom about it, but he didn't want to sound paranoid or frightened, so he tried to ask the question as casually as possible. While she was cooking in the kitchen, he looked over at her and asked, "Did you hear anything strange last night?" He was hoping she might say no. If she hadn't heard anything, then maybe it had been just his imagination. Maybe it had been part of the dream. Maybe his mind had simply played a trick on him. But that's not what happened. When she turned around to answer him, he immediately saw that something was wrong. She had tears running down her face. She looked shaken and pale, and she told him that she had heard it too. She had heard the same voice in the middle of the night. The same deep voice speaking the same strange words. After that, neither of them could easily explain what had happened. They talked about it many times afterward. trying to understand what they had experienced. Was it some kind of shared dream? Was it something their minds created during sleep? Or was it something else entirely? Even years later, my dad never found a clear answer. But whenever he tells the story, you can still hear the uncertainty in his voice, because some experiences leave questions that never fully go away. One of the stories that has stayed in my family for generations comes from my great-grandfather. He served as a medic in the American Army during the First World War. Like many people who lived through that time, he didn't talk about the war very often. When he did, his stories were usually short and matter-of-fact, never dramatic or exaggerated. Most of the time he focused on the practical parts of his job, treating injured soldiers, carrying wounded men away from the battlefield, and trying to keep people alive in conditions that were far worse than anything most of us can imagine today. But once, many years after the war, he shared a story that wasn't about medical work or battlefield injuries. It was a story someone else had told him while they were both serving overseas. Even though it had been passed from one soldier to another, it left a strong impression on him. He said it was one of the strangest things he had ever heard about the war. During his time in Europe, my great-grandfather had become friends with a British soldier. In the chaos of wartime, friendships like that were fairly common. Soldiers from different countries often found themselves working together, sharing supplies, stories, and whatever small comforts they could find while stationed in the trenches. This British soldier had already been fighting for a long time by the time my great-grandfather met him. He had joined the war early and had survived several brutal battles. By the time he told the story, he had seen more combat than most soldiers ever did. One night, while the two of them were talking, the British soldier began describing something that had happened earlier in the war. The event had taken place during the Battle of the Somme in 1916. To understand the story properly, it helps to know just how terrible that battle was. The Somme lasted for about 3 months and became one of the bloodiest battles in human history. More than 1 million soldiers were killed or wounded during that time. The fighting stretched across miles of muddy trenches, shattered forests, and open fields filled with craters from artillery shells. Most soldiers who fought there described it as a living nightmare. The trenches were wet, filthy, and overcrowded. Rats and disease were common. The air often smelled of smoke, mud, and decay. During the day, the battlefield was filled with explosions, gunfire, and chaos. But sometimes, late at night, the fighting would grow quiet for a short while. Those quiet moments could feel almost eerie because everyone knew the violence could start again at any second. According to the British soldier, the strange event happened during one of those quiet nights. He and several other soldiers were standing watch in the trenches. It was their job to stay awake and alert while the rest of the unit tried to sleep. They were responsible for keeping an eye on the battlefield in case enemy soldiers tried to approach under the cover of darkness. The area directly in front of the trenches was known as No Man's Land. It was a stretch of ground between the opposing sides, usually filled with barbed wire, broken equipment, and the bodies of soldiers who had fallen during earlier fighting. No Man's Land was one of the most dangerous places on the battlefield. Anyone caught out there was exposed to gunfire from both sides. During active combat, soldiers sometimes had to cross that ground in massive charges, but at night it was usually empty. On that particular night, the battlefield had become unusually quiet. There was no gunfire and no movement from the enemy trenches. The soldiers on watch were simply scanning the darkness, waiting for their shift to end. That was when one of them noticed something moving out in No Man's Land. At first it looked like a distant shape, barely visible in the darkness. The soldier pointed it out to the others, and soon several men were staring in the same direction. Whatever it was, it didn't move the way a normal person would. The figure appeared tall and thin, almost unnaturally narrow in the dim light. It was completely covered in something dark that hid its shape. The British soldier described it as looking like it was wrapped in long black material, almost like a cloak or heavy fabric hanging from its shoulders. But the strangest thing about it was how it moved. Instead of walking the way a person normally would, the figure seemed to glide slowly across the ground. The movement was smooth and steady, almost silent. It drifted through the torn landscape of no man's land without making any obvious effort. Every few moments it would stop. When it stopped, it would kneel down beside something on the ground. The soldier said he believed those spots were the places where fallen soldiers lay. After kneeling for a few seconds, the figure would rise again and continue gliding across the field. It repeated this strange pattern several times. Move slowly forward, stop, kneel beside a body, rise again, continue moving. The soldiers watching from the trench were completely silent. Normally, if they saw someone moving in no man's land, they would immediately shout a warning or fire their rifles, but none of them did. The sight of that figure created a strange feeling among the men. It was a mixture of confusion and fear. Something about the way it moved didn't seem human. The British soldier said that he and the others simply stared at it. No one spoke. No one fired a shot. They just watched. After a minute or two, the figure began moving farther away from the trench line. The darkness of the battlefield grew thicker as it moved deeper into no man's land. Then something even stranger happened. The figure seemed to fade. At first, it became harder to see. Then it blended completely into the shadows. Within seconds, it was gone. There was no sudden movement, no sound, no clear direction where it might have gone. It simply disappeared into the darkness as if it had never been there. The soldiers continued staring at the empty field for several minutes, waiting to see if it would return. But nothing else happened. Eventually, the quiet of the battlefield returned completely. The British soldier told my great-grandfather that none of the men on watch that night ever fully understood what they had seen. Some believed it might have been a wounded soldier moving strangely through the darkness. Others thought it might have been a trick of the light or a shadow caused by the moon. But none of those explanations seemed to fit perfectly. The way the figure moved had felt too smooth and unnatural, and the way it vanished had been even harder to explain. What stayed with the soldiers most was the strange feeling they experienced while watching it. Even though they were trained to react immediately to movement on the battlefield, none of them had been able to shout or fire. It was as if something about the figure had silenced them completely. When the British soldier finished telling the story, my great-grandfather said the man simply shrugged and moved on to another subject. War was full of strange experiences, and many soldiers learned not to dwell too much on things they couldn't explain. But the story stayed with my great-grandfather for the rest of his life. Years later, when he told it to me, he didn't try to suggest that the soldiers had seen anything supernatural. He simply repeated what the British soldier had described. A tall, dark figure moving silently through no man's land on a quiet night during one of the bloodiest battles in history, stopping beside the fallen and then disappearing into the darkness. When this happened, I was very young, probably around 6 or 7 years old. At that age, the world still feels very big and mysterious, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between imagination and reality. Even so, some memories stay clear in your mind for years, and this is one of those moments that I can still picture very clearly. At the time, my family and I lived in East London in a council house. It wasn't a huge place, but it was always full of life because there were quite a few of us living there. I had several siblings, and the house was usually busy with people moving from room to room, watching television, talking in the kitchen, or arguing over something small the way families often do. The house had 2 floors. Downstairs was the living room and the kitchen, while upstairs held the bedrooms and the bathroom. The stairs were narrow and creaky, and the hallway upstairs always felt a little darker than the rest of the house because the window at the end didn't let in much light. One particular day, I remember being at home with only a few people around. My mum was downstairs in the living room talking with my aunt. They were sitting together and chatting the way adults do when they haven't seen each other for a while. Everyone else in the house had gone out. My dad had taken my siblings with him somewhere, though I can't remember exactly where they had gone. All I know is that they weren't home. So in the house at that moment, it was just my mum, my aunt, and me. At that age, I spent a lot of time wandering around the house on my own, moving from one room to another and finding ways to entertain myself. Sometimes I would play with toys. Sometimes I would watch television, and sometimes I would just explore the house out of boredom. On that particular day, I decided to go upstairs. I slowly climbed the stairs and walked into the hallway. The house was quiet up there since no one else was around. You could faintly hear my mum and aunt talking downstairs, but otherwise the upstairs area felt calm and empty. My sister had a bedroom down the hallway, and I often wandered into her room when she wasn't there, just to look around or sit at her desk. She had a type of bed that was raised high off the ground with a desk underneath it. It was one of those beds that kids sometimes have, where the sleeping area is above and the space below is used for a study desk or a place to sit. Because I was quite short at that age, the bed always seemed very high to me. If I stood beside it, I couldn't easily see what was on top of the mattress unless I stepped back or climbed up a little. That day I walked into her room the way I normally would. When I looked toward the bed, I saw something that immediately made me think my sister was there. From where I was standing, I could see the shape of someone lying on the bed. It looked like a girl lying down on the mattress. I couldn't see her face clearly because of the angle and the height of the bed, but the shape of the body was clear enough for my young mind to assume it was my sister. I remember thinking it was strange that she was home because I believed she had gone out with my dad and the others. But as a child, you don't always question things deeply. Sometimes you just accept what you see in front of you. So I called her name. I said her name once and waited for an answer. There was no response. I called her name again. Still nothing. The figure didn't move or react at all. I thought maybe she was asleep. That seemed like a reasonable explanation. Maybe she had come home earlier, or maybe I had simply misunderstood who had gone out with my dad. Since she didn't answer, I didn't think too much about it. I just assumed she must be sleeping and didn't want to wake up. So I left her room and went into my own bedroom. For the next half hour or so, I stayed there doing whatever 6-year-olds usually do to pass the time. I probably played with toys, looked out the window, or just sat around imagining things. Everything felt normal. Then suddenly, something broke the quiet of the house. Our dog started barking. His name was Jack, and he was normally a friendly and relaxed dog. But when he barked like this, it was loud and aggressive. It sounded like he was going crazy. The barking echoed up the hallway and immediately caught my attention. It didn't sound like his normal barking when someone knocked at the door or when he wanted attention. This sounded different. Curious and a little concerned, I stepped out of my room to see what was going on. When I looked down the hallway, I saw Jack standing inside my sister's room. He was facing the bed. His body was stiff and tense, and he was growling loudly while barking at the mattress. It looked like he was extremely upset about something. The fur along his back was raised, and he kept pacing in small circles while staring at the bed. I stood there confused for a moment, trying to understand why he was acting that way. From my perspective, I still believed my sister was lying on the bed asleep, so I didn't see any reason for Jack to be reacting like that. The noise quickly caught the attention of my mum and my aunt downstairs. Within seconds, I heard their footsteps rushing up the stairs. When they reached the hallway, they immediately asked what was going on. They could hear Jack barking and growling in the room. My mum grabbed a bat that was kept nearby, and my aunt had a knife in her hand. They clearly thought something serious might be happening. Both of them moved carefully toward my sister's room. At that moment, I tried to reassure them. I said something like, "Mum, he's probably just growling at Alex." Alex was my sister's name, but as soon as I said that, my mum looked at me and said something that made me pause. She said, "No, Alex is out with your dad." For a moment, I didn't understand what she meant. And then I looked back toward the bed. Jack was still barking and growling at it. But when my mum stepped closer and looked up at the mattress, there was no one there. The bed was completely empty. The blanket was flat and undisturbed. There was no sign that anyone had been lying there at all. The figure I had seen earlier was gone. My mum and aunt searched the room carefully, checking around the desk under the bed, looking in the closet, and glancing behind the door. There was no one anywhere. The entire room was empty. Jack eventually stopped barking after a while, though he still seemed uneasy for a few minutes. Eventually, everything settled down again. My mum asked me what I had seen, and I told her that earlier I thought I had seen Alex lying on the bed. But since she wasn't actually home, no one could explain what I had seen. Over time, the moment became more like a strange memory rather than something truly frightening. Some people might find the story creepy when they hear it, especially the part about the figure on the bed disappearing. But when I look back on it now, it doesn't scare me very much. I was a very young kid at the time, and children's imaginations can sometimes fill in details that aren't really there. Maybe the shape of the blanket looked like a person lying down. Maybe the lighting in the room created a shadow that tricked my eyes. Or maybe my mind simply expected to see my sister and created that image automatically. Whatever the explanation was, it remains one of those odd childhood memories that never completely leaves you. Even though it happened many years ago, I can still remember walking into that room, looking up at the high bed, and seeing what I believed was someone lying there quietly, and then later standing in the hallway watching our dog bark and growl at the very same bed, only to find it completely empty. When I was growing up, there was a huge storm drainage system that ran through the city, not far from where I lived. It wasn't something most people thought about much. From the surface, you would only notice small openings in the ground or large concrete channels where rainwater flowed after heavy storms. But underneath the city, there was an entire network of tunnels that carried water away during storms and floods. For kids like my friends and me, that place felt like an underground world waiting to be explored. When you're young, you are always looking for adventure, especially the kind that feels just a little bit dangerous. The storm drains gave us exactly that kind of thrill. We had heard about them from older kids who said the tunnels went on for miles beneath the city. They said you could ride your bikes inside them and travel through places that no adults ever bothered to go. So naturally, we wanted to see it for ourselves. The first time we explored those tunnels, we came prepared in the only way kids really know how. We brought our bikes and flashlights. Most of us didn't have fancy headlamps or proper gear, so we did the next best thing. We taped our flashlights directly onto the handlebars of our bikes with duct tape. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. When the lights were turned on, the beam shined straight ahead as we rode, lighting up the curved concrete walls and the wet ground beneath our tires. The first time we rode down into the storm drain system, it felt exciting and strange all at once. The tunnels were huge, far bigger than we expected. Some of them were tall enough that you could stand up straight without touching the ceiling. Others were wide enough for several bikes to ride side by side. The sound down there was different too. Every movement echoed through the tunnel. The sound of our bike tires rolling across the concrete floor bounced off the walls and traveled far down the tunnels ahead of us. Sometimes water trickled along the center of the tunnel, creating a thin stream that reflected the beam of our lights. It felt like exploring a secret part of the city that almost nobody else knew about. Most of the time, we stayed in the main tunnels where the water flowed downhill toward the river. These paths were easy to follow because the direction of the water always showed which way led out. As long as you kept riding downstream, you could usually find your way back to one of the large openings where the drainage system connected to the outside world. But sometimes we got curious. Instead of following the water, we would ride upstream into tunnels that didn't seem to lead anywhere obvious. Those tunnels branched off in strange directions. Some of them got narrower, others curved sharply or split into multiple paths. It was easy to get turned around in those areas. There were moments when we would stop our bikes and look at each other, realizing we had no idea exactly where we were anymore. Still, we knew one important rule. If things ever got confusing, all we had to do was ride back toward the flowing water and follow it downstream. Eventually, that would lead us back to an exit. In the worst-case scenario, we could always try to climb out through a manhole. But that wasn't always easy. The manholes were often very far apart, sometimes miles away from each other. And even if you found one, pushing it open from below could be difficult. Not to mention that when you climbed out, you had no idea where you would appear on the surface. Sometimes it could be in the middle of a busy street. So we usually avoided using those unless absolutely necessary. One afternoon, we decided to explore deeper into the upstream tunnels than we ever had before. There were 3 or 4 of us riding together that day. We moved slowly through the tunnels, shining our lights ahead of us and talking as we went. The deeper we went, the stranger the tunnels became. The walls were covered in graffiti. Some of it looked like the usual stuff you see in places like that. Names, symbols, random drawings, and spray-painted tags left by people who had come down there before us. But then we saw something that stood out. On one section of the wall, written in large letters, was a message that read, "Turn back or die." The letters were painted in thick red spray paint. For a moment we stopped our bikes and looked at it. Someone joked that it was probably just another piece of graffiti meant to scare people. And honestly, we believed that too. When you're a teenager exploring tunnels with your friends, things like that feel more exciting than frightening. Instead of turning around, we kept going. The tunnel eventually opened up into a larger chamber where several different tunnels connected together. It was like a meeting point where water from multiple directions could flow into the main drainage system. But what really caught our attention wasn't the tunnels. It was what was inside the room. The entire area was filled with strange objects. There were candles placed on small stone platforms. There were piles of bones scattered around the floor. Some of the bones looked like animal bones, though we didn't get close enough to inspect them carefully. There were also symbols painted on the walls that looked like something out of a horror movie. At the center of the room was what looked like a makeshift altar. The whole place looked like someone had tried to create a fake ritual site. At first glance, it looked creepy, but after a moment we started laughing about it. Most of us had seen similar things before. Teenagers sometimes create dramatic setups like that just to look edgy or mysterious. There were always kids trying to act like goths or pretending to be involved in dark rituals. So we assumed it was just another example of that. Something meant to look scary but not actually serious. Because of that, we didn't feel particularly worried. We rode slowly around the room, shining our lights at the walls and joking about the decorations. Then something happened that instantly changed the mood. From one of the connecting tunnels, we heard movement. At first, it was just a faint echo. Then we heard footsteps. Someone was running. All of us turned our lights toward the tunnel where the sound was coming from. Out of the darkness, several figures suddenly appeared. There were 3 or 4 of them. They were wearing long robes, and they were running directly toward us. In their hands, they were holding machetes. For a split second, none of us moved. Our brains were trying to process what we were seeing. Then instinct took over. Someone shouted something like, "Go!" And suddenly all of us jumped back onto our bikes. We turned around and started pedaling as fast as we possibly could. The tunnel echoed with the sound of our tires and our panicked breathing. Behind us, we could hear shouting and footsteps. I have never ridden a bike faster in my entire life. The adrenaline rushing through my body made everything feel sharp and intense. The beam from my flashlight bounced wildly across the tunnel walls as I sped forward. It felt like being inside a high-speed racing game. The only comparison I can think of is something like F-Zero, where everything moves at incredible speed and you barely have time to react. The tunnel stretched ahead of us in a long, dark line. All we could do was keep pedaling and hope we reached the main tunnel before those guys caught up. Eventually, we reached a section where the water was flowing again. That meant we were heading back toward the main drainage route. We followed the water as fast as we could, racing through the tunnel and not daring to slow down. Finally, we saw daylight ahead. The opening of the drainage system appeared in the distance. We burst out into the sunlight and didn't stop riding until we were far away from the entrance. None of us spoke for a while. We were too busy catching our breath and trying to calm our racing hearts. To this day, that remains one of the fastest bike rides I have ever taken, and definitely one of the most terrifying moments of my childhood adventures, exploring those tunnels under the city. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. It happened on a normal day when nothing unusual was going on at all. I was just sitting in my room, doing the kinds of things people usually do when they are alone and trying to pass time. I might have been looking at my phone, reading something online, or just relaxing and enjoying a quiet moment in the house. It wasn't late at night or anything dramatic like that. It was simply an ordinary part of the day. Our house isn't very small, but it isn't huge either. Still, the way it's built means that sound sometimes travels strangely from one room to another. There are long hallways, a couple of closed doors between sections of the house, and a living area that sits toward the center. Because of that, noises can echo or bounce in odd ways, sometimes making it difficult to tell exactly where something came from. But at that moment, I was sitting in my room near the back part of the house. My door was partly open and the hallway outside was quiet. The television wasn't on and no one was playing music anywhere, so the house felt calm and still. Then suddenly, I heard a loud crash. The sound was sharp and heavy, the kind of noise that immediately makes you jump and look up. It wasn't a small sound like something being dropped on the floor. It sounded much bigger than that. The closest thing I could compare it to was a bookcase falling over. If you've ever heard a tall shelf collapse or a heavy piece of furniture tip and hit the floor, you know the kind of sound it makes. There's a deep thud followed by the rattling noise of objects shifting or sliding. That's exactly what it sounded like. The noise seemed to come from somewhere on the other side of the house. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the doorway and listening. Sometimes houses make strange noises when things settle or shift slightly. Wood can creak, pipes can bang, and occasionally something small falls over. But this didn't sound like a normal house noise. This sounded like something large had fallen. After a few seconds, I got up from my chair and walked out of my room to investigate. My first thought was that maybe one of the tall shelves in the living room or hallway had tipped over. We had a couple of bookcases in the house, and if one of them had fallen, it would definitely make a sound like the one I heard. I walked down the hallway and toward the area where I believed the noise had come from. Everything looked normal. Nothing was on the floor. No furniture had moved. No shelves had collapsed. I stood there for a moment, confused. I checked the living room first, looking carefully at the walls and furniture. The bookshelves were still standing exactly where they had always been. None of the books had fallen, and nothing looked disturbed. Then I checked the dining area and the kitchen. Again, everything looked exactly the same as it always did. No chairs were knocked over, no cabinets were open, nothing appeared to have fallen or broken. At that point, I started wondering if maybe the sound had come from somewhere else in the house. We also had a dog and a cat, and sometimes animals can accidentally knock things over when they jump onto furniture or climb onto shelves. So I decided to check where they were. If one of them had knocked something down, they would probably still be nearby. I walked back toward the hallway and started looking around for them. After a short search, I found both of them together. They were sitting quietly in the bathroom across from my room. The dog was lying on the floor, and the cat was sitting beside him like nothing unusual had happened. Neither of them looked nervous or excited. Animals often react to loud noises, especially sudden crashes. If they had caused the sound or been near it, they might have been running around or acting restless. But they looked completely calm. That only made the situation stranger. If the pets hadn't knocked something over and no furniture had fallen, then what had made that noise? I started going through possible explanations in my mind. Maybe something had fallen outside the house. Maybe a neighbor had dropped something heavy, and the sound carried through the walls. But the way the sound echoed in the house had made it feel like it came from inside. I decided to ask the other people who were home at the time. My mom was outside in the backyard. Coincidentally, she was actually near the area where the sound seemed to have come from inside the house. If anything had fallen or crashed in that part of the house, she would have probably heard it. So I walked outside and asked her if she had heard a loud noise a few minutes earlier. She looked at me with a confused expression. She said she hadn't heard anything at all. I tried describing the sound to her, explaining that it was loud and sounded like a bookcase falling over, but she insisted she hadn't heard anything like that. That surprised me. The noise had been so loud that I assumed everyone in the house must have heard it. Still curious, I went back inside and asked my sister if she had heard the crash. She had been near my room at the time, closer to the hallway where the sound had echoed. But she also looked confused and said she had no idea what I was talking about. She said everything had been quiet on her end. At that point, I started questioning myself. Had I imagined the sound? It didn't feel like imagination. The noise had been too clear and too sudden. But if it had really happened, why hadn't anyone else heard it? And why couldn't I find any sign of what caused it? I walked through the house one more time, checking every room slowly. I opened doors, looked behind furniture, and even checked closets just in case something small had fallen somewhere unexpected. But every room looked perfectly normal. Nothing was broken, nothing had moved. There was no sign that anything heavy had fallen or crashed. Eventually, I gave up searching and went back to my room. But the experience left me feeling uneasy. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about that sound. Every little noise in the house made me pause and listen. If a door creaked or a floorboard shifted, I immediately looked up to see what it was. Even though nothing else strange happened, the feeling of uncertainty stayed with me. It's strange how something so small can affect your mood for hours. Normally, our house feels comfortable and familiar, but after hearing that unexplained crash, every quiet corner felt a little more mysterious. I kept replaying the sound in my mind, trying to remember exactly how it had echoed through the hallway. It really did sound like something large had fallen, yet there was no evidence anywhere. As the day went on, I tried to come up with logical explanations. Maybe the sound had come from outside, but echoed strangely through the walls. Maybe a neighbor had dropped something heavy in their house or garage. Or maybe something had shifted slightly inside our house and then settled back into place before I found it. Still, none of those explanations felt completely satisfying. By the time evening came around, I had mostly calmed down, but the memory of that sudden crash stayed with me. It's one of those small moments that isn't exactly terrifying, but it leaves you with an odd sense of mystery. A single loud noise, no visible cause, no one else hearing it. And a quiet house that suddenly feels just a little less ordinary than it did before. When I was very young, I had an experience that stayed with me for the rest of my life. It's one of those childhood memories that might sound strange or unbelievable to other people, but when you're the one who lived through it, the details never really fade away. Even years later, I can still remember that night clearly, almost like it happened yesterday. At the time, I was just a kid living at home with my family. Our house wasn't very large, but it always felt warm and familiar. My bedroom was small but comfortable. I had a bed pushed against the wall, a little nightstand beside it, and a few toys scattered around the floor the way most kids do. Like many children, I believed in things that adults later tell you are just stories. Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and of course the Tooth Fairy were all part of that magical world of childhood. Losing a tooth was exciting because it meant you could put it under your pillow and wake up the next morning to find a small gift or a coin in its place. It felt like a secret tradition shared between children everywhere. On the night this happened, I had recently lost one of my teeth. I remember placing it carefully under my pillow before going to sleep. I was excited, imagining that the Tooth Fairy would come during the night and take it away. The idea of a tiny magical creature flying into the room while I slept fascinated me. Eventually I fell asleep, probably thinking about what kind of surprise might be waiting for me in the morning. Sometime later during the night, something woke me up. At first I wasn't fully aware of what had happened. My mind was still half asleep, floating somewhere between dreams and reality. But I definitely felt something move near my pillow. It was like a gentle jostling, the kind of movement you might feel if someone carefully lifted the pillow while you were resting on it. The sensation pulled me out of my sleep. My eyes slowly opened. For a moment I stayed perfectly still, trying to understand what was happening. The room was dark and the only light came from a faint glow through the window. Then I noticed movement near the side of my bed. Someone was there. The figure was standing beside me, leaning slightly toward the pillow where I had placed the tooth earlier. At first, my sleepy mind assumed exactly what a child would assume. The Tooth Fairy had come, but the moment didn't feel magical the way I had imagined. Something about the presence in the room felt strange and unsettling. I stayed quiet and pretended to still be asleep. The figure beside my bed seemed to finish whatever it had been doing. Then it slowly turned and began walking toward the door of my room. As it moved away, curiosity got the better of me. I carefully lifted my head just enough to peek. What I saw next is the part that has never left my memory. The figure walking away from my bed looked like a woman. She had long brown hair that reached down her back, but everything else about her appearance was deeply unsettling. She was completely naked. Her skin looked pale in the dim light coming through the window. The shape of her body was visible as she walked slowly toward the doorway. But the most disturbing detail was what I saw on her back. She had wings. At first, that might sound beautiful or magical, like the kind of wings people imagine fairies having. But these wings looked nothing like the delicate feathery wings from storybooks. They looked wrong. The wings seemed to be made of skin, thin, stretched layers of skin that hung between long, bone-like structures. The closest thing I can compare them to is something you might see in a horror movie. The skin looked almost melted in places, as if it had once been soft wax that had dripped and hardened over the bones underneath. The edges of the wings seemed uneven, almost as if parts of the skin had sagged or stretched too far. As the figure walked away from my bed, the wings shifted slightly with each step. The sight was strange enough that my child's mind struggled to understand what I was looking at. For a moment I wondered if I was still dreaming, but everything felt real. The room was quiet, except for the faint sound of movement as the figure crossed the floor. She didn't look back toward me. She simply walked calmly toward the door. Her long brown hair moved slightly across her shoulders as she stepped into the hallway. Then she disappeared from view. I stayed frozen in my bed. My heart was beating quickly, but I was too confused and frightened to make any noise. After a while, I slowly lowered my head back onto the pillow. The room was silent again. Eventually, I fell asleep, though the memory of what I had seen stayed in the back of my mind even then. When morning came, I immediately checked under my pillow. The tooth was gone. In its place was the small reward that the tooth fairy was supposed to leave behind. To a child, that seemed like confirmation that something real had happened. But even then, I knew what I had seen didn't match the cheerful stories about a friendly fairy. As I got older, I thought about that night many times. My first instinct was to consider whether it might have been my mother. After all, many parents quietly sneak into their children's rooms at night to exchange the tooth for money. But that explanation didn't match what I had seen. My mother had short blonde hair. The figure I saw had long brown hair. Their body shapes were different too, and most importantly, no one else in our household looked anything like that figure. The wings alone were something I couldn't explain. Over time, I realized that childhood memories can sometimes be influenced by dreams or imagination. It's possible that my mind combined a real moment, someone taking the tooth, with elements from a dream. But the vividness of that image has never faded. Even today, I can clearly picture the back of that figure walking out of my room. The long brown hair, the strange wings made of thin, stretched skin, the quiet way she left without ever turning around. Because of that experience, I've always had a strange relationship with the idea of the tooth fairy. Most people eventually laugh about those childhood beliefs and move on. But for me, the story never felt completely imaginary. Even now, many years later, I still think about that night sometimes. And when I lose a tooth or remember those childhood traditions, a small part of me still wonders whether something truly strange visited my room all those years ago. I can't say for certain what I saw. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe it was a trick of a half-awake mind. Or maybe it was something else entirely. But one thing is certain. That night left a lasting impression on me. Even now, I still keep my pillow arranged in a way that would make it difficult for anyone or anything to reach underneath it without waking me, just in case. When I was 8 years old, my mother decided to take my brother and me on a trip back to the Philippines. She had grown up there in a small village before moving to North America, and she wanted us to see the place where she spent her childhood. At that age, I didn't fully understand how important the trip was to her. To me, it just felt like an adventure, a long journey to a place that was completely different from the world I was used to. Growing up in North America, my life had been fairly comfortable. We had a house, clean streets, grocery stores nearby, and all the little things that children usually take for granted. I never really thought about how different life could be in other parts of the world. As a child, You simply accept your surroundings as normal. When we arrived in my mom's home village, everything felt unfamiliar and exciting. The air was warmer and more humid than what I was used to. The houses were smaller, many of them built from wood or simple materials. The roads were rough and sometimes just dirt paths that wound between the homes. There were chickens wandering around freely, people talking outside in the evenings, and children running barefoot across the ground without worrying about it. Life seemed slower and more connected to the land. My brother and I were curious about everything. Every little detail felt new to us. Our relatives welcomed us warmly. Many of them we had never met before, but they treated us like we had always been part of the village. My cousins were especially excited to have us there because it meant more people to play with. As children, we didn't spend much time thinking about the differences between our lives and theirs. We were simply excited to explore, run around, and enjoy being somewhere new. One of the first things that caught our attention was a dog that lived near the house where we were staying. She was a female dog that stayed around the yard most of the time. She wasn't a pet in the same way dogs are treated in North America, where they might sleep inside the house or have special toys and food bowls. In the village, she was more like part of the environment, an animal that lived nearby and moved around freely. She had a puppy with her as well, a young male that followed her everywhere. The two of them quickly became our favorite companions during those first few days. My cousin, my brother, and I spent hours playing with them. While we would run around the yard while the puppy chased us. Sometimes we would sit on the ground and let the little dog climb into our laps. The mother dog was gentle and calm. She often stayed close to the puppy, watching quietly while we played. To us, they felt like friends. We didn't think about where they came from or who they belonged to. We simply enjoyed their company. For a few days, that became part of our routine. We would wake up in the morning, eat breakfast with the family, and then run outside to find the dogs and play. The village was full of life and small adventures for kids. There were trees to climb, paths to explore, and cousins to run around with. Everything felt simple and carefree. Then one morning something happened that completely changed the way I saw that place. I woke up earlier than usual. At first I didn't understand why. The house was quiet, but there was a strange sound outside. It sounded like crying. The sound was faint but clear enough to catch my attention. Still half asleep, I got out of bed and walked outside to see what was going on. The morning air was warm and the sunlight was just beginning to spread across the yard. Then I saw something that made me freeze. The mother dog was hanging from a tree. For a moment, my mind refused to accept what I was seeing. I stood there staring at the scene, trying to understand it. The image was shocking, especially for an 8-year-old who had never seen anything like that before. The dog that we had been playing with just the day before was now hanging from a rope tied to one of the tree branches. I remember feeling a mix of confusion, sadness, and disbelief. It didn't make sense to me. My first thought was that something terrible had happened, like someone had hurt her for no reason. I turned and ran back toward the house to find my mom. When I asked her what had happened, she explained it to me in a calm but serious voice. She told me that the dog had been killed for food. In the village, people sometimes used whatever animals were available to provide meals for the family. Life there was much harder than what we were used to in North America. Many families didn't have steady access to the kinds of food we took for granted. The idea of eating a dog was something I had never even imagined before. In the world I grew up in, dogs were pets, companions, and members of the family. Hearing that explanation made something shift in my understanding of the world. For the first time in my life, I realized how different life could be for people who didn't have the same resources we did. Even though my mother tried to explain the situation in a practical way, the image of that dog hanging from the tree stayed with me. It was one of those moments that suddenly forces a child to see reality in a new way. But the story didn't end there. Even after hearing the explanation, I kept thinking about the crying sound that had woken me up. It hadn't sounded like the adults in the house. It had sounded like a child. So I started looking around the yard to see if one of my cousins was nearby. After searching for a few minutes, I finally found him. He was hiding underneath the house. In many homes in that village, the houses were built slightly above the ground on wooden supports. That left a small space underneath where children sometimes crawled around or stored things. When I looked under the house, I saw my cousin sitting there quietly. He was holding something in his arms. It was the puppy, the little male dog that had been following his mother everywhere. The puppy had dug itself partly into the dirt, almost like it had tried to hide or bury itself. My cousin was holding it gently, and tears were running down his face. He was crying quietly while holding the dog close to his chest. I had never seen someone show that kind of sadness before. The look on his face was filled with grief and compassion at the same time. Even though he lived in that village and understood the realities of life there much better than I did, he was still heartbroken by what had happened. He held the puppy carefully, almost like he was trying to protect it. The puppy looked confused and frightened, not understanding where its mother had gone. For a long moment, I simply stood there watching. I didn't know what to say. That scene stayed in my mind even more strongly than the moment I saw the dog hanging from the tree. Seeing my cousin holding the puppy, crying quietly, showed me something powerful. It showed me that even in a place where people sometimes had to make difficult choices to survive, kindness and empathy still existed. The compassion in his face was something I had never seen so clearly before. In that moment, I realized that sadness and love for animals could exist even in the middle of harsh realities. That experience changed the way I thought about many things. It was one of the first times I truly understood what poverty meant and how different life could be outside the world I had grown up in. But more than that, it showed me how deeply people can care, even when circumstances force them to accept things that seem impossible to understand. Even today, many years later, I still remember that morning clearly. The warm air, the quiet village, the shock of what I saw, and the image of my cousin sitting under the house holding the frightened puppy. It was one of those childhood memories that stays with you forever, not because it was simply sad, but because it revealed something important about the world and the people in it. When I was 12 years old, my younger sister and I spent part of our summer visiting our grandparents in West Texas. My sister was about 8 at the time, and the two of us were excited about the trip long before it even started. Visiting our grandparents always felt like a small adventure because their home was very different from the place where we usually lived. Their house sat on a large ranch surrounded by open land that stretched out for miles. There weren't many nearby neighbors, and the area felt quiet and isolated compared to the towns and cities we were used to. During the daytime, you could see wide fields, dusty roads, and endless sky in every direction. At night, the stars were brighter than anything I had ever seen back home. Even though I had visited before, the place still felt mysterious in its own way. The house itself was old and full of heavy wooden furniture that looked like it had been there for decades. There were creaky floorboards, long hallways, and rooms that smelled faintly of old wood and dust. When my sister and I arrived for that visit, my grandparents prepared the spare bedroom for us. That was the room we would be sharing during our stay. The spare room had one piece of furniture that immediately caught our attention. In the center of the room stood a massive 4-poster king-sized bed. To a kid, it looked enormous. The wooden posts rose high above the mattress, and the bed frame itself sat much higher off the ground than a normal bed. When you climbed onto it, you almost felt like you were climbing up onto a small platform. My sister and I thought it was the coolest bed we had ever seen. Because it was so big, the two of us could easily share it without feeling crowded. At the foot of the bed, directly across from where we slept, there was a large dresser pushed up against the wall. Attached to the dresser was an old mirror. The mirror looked aged and slightly worn, the kind of mirror you might see in an antique store. The glass had small imperfections and scratches that made reflections look a little distorted if you looked too closely. One strange thing about the mirror was that it leaned slightly forward. Instead of sitting perfectly straight against the wall, it tilted outward just enough to reflect more of the room's floor than you might normally expect. At the time, we didn't think much about it. To us, it was just part of the room. For the first few nights, everything was completely normal. We spent our days exploring the ranch, walking around the property, and enjoying the freedom of being far away from the routines of school and home. But one particular night turned into something I will never forget. Late that evening, a thunderstorm rolled in across the plains. In West Texas, storms can arrive suddenly and with a lot of intensity. Dark clouds gather quickly, wind begins to howl across the open land, and within minutes the sky can explode with lightning and thunder. That night was exactly like that. The rain started pounding against the roof, and flashes of lightning lit up the sky outside the windows. For me, the storm wasn't really scary. I had always liked the sound of rain and thunder. There was something relaxing about lying in bed while a storm moved across the landscape outside. The steady rhythm of rain hitting the roof often helped me fall asleep faster. So when the thunderstorm started, I simply curled up under the blanket and drifted off. Sometime later, though, I was suddenly awakened. At first, I didn't understand what had happened. My sister's hand was covering my mouth. I woke up startled and confused. My first reaction was irritation. Being woken up like that in the middle of the night isn't exactly pleasant, and I was about to push her hand away and tell her to stop messing around. But then I looked at her face, and the words never came out. Her eyes were wide with fear. Tears were running down her cheeks, and her entire body looked tense. She wasn't playing a joke, she was terrified. For a moment I just stared at her, trying to understand what was going on. Was she scared of the thunderstorm? Had she just woken up from a nightmare? The room was dark, except for the occasional flash of lightning from outside. Every few seconds the sky would light up through the window, briefly illuminating the room before darkness returned again. My sister slowly removed her hand from my mouth. Then she raised a finger to her lips, signaling for me to stay quiet. After that, she pointed toward the foot of the bed. Because the bed was so tall, I couldn't see the floor directly from where I was lying. At first, I saw nothing, just darkness. Then my eyes shifted toward the dresser and the old mirror attached to it. The mirror's slight forward tilt meant it reflected part of the floor at the foot of the bed. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I began to notice something strange in the reflection. At first, it looked like a shadow. Something lying on the floor. My brain struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. Then lightning flashed again. For just a second, the entire room lit up, and in that brief flash, I saw it clearly. There was a man lying on the floor at the foot of our bed. He was curled into a fetal position with his back facing the mirror. Part of his body was actually tucked slightly underneath the bed frame. The moment I understood what I was seeing, a wave of pure fear rushed through my body. My mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. There was a stranger in our room. For a split second, I felt completely frozen. Then instinct took over. Adrenaline surged through my body. I grabbed my sister's arm and pulled her with me as we jumped off the bed. We ran straight for the bedroom door. I yanked it open, pulled her into the hallway, and slammed the door behind us. Neither of us stopped running until we reached our grandparents' bedroom. Our grandparents were asleep, but the sudden noise of us bursting into the room woke them up instantly. My heart was racing so fast I could barely speak. Trying to stay calm, I explained what we had seen. I told them there was a man lying on the floor in our bedroom. My grandfather didn't hesitate. He reached over to his bedside table and grabbed his revolver. Living on a ranch in Texas, that kind of response wasn't unusual. Firearms were simply a part of everyday life there. He told my sister and me to stay in the room with our grandmother while he went to check. Then he walked down the hallway toward the spare bedroom. From where we were sitting, we could hear the sound of him opening the door and moving around inside. For a moment, there was silence, then the sound of him searching the room. After a few minutes, he came back. The room was empty. Whoever had been there was gone. My grandfather searched the rest of the house carefully, but didn't find anyone. The only unusual thing he noticed was water on the floor near the doorway and parts of the hallway. After thinking about it for a while, he came to a conclusion. He believed the man we had seen was likely someone who had crossed the border and was trying to avoid being caught. Our grandparents' ranch was located in West Texas, about 2 hours from the border. Because of that, they had occasionally encountered people traveling through the land while trying to move farther north. According to my grandfather, the man had probably entered the house seeking shelter from the storm. Nay, the heavy rain and lightning would have made it difficult for someone traveling across open land. Once the man realized the house was occupied and that we had noticed him, he must have slipped out quietly before my grandfather reached the room. Even though that explanation made sense, the experience left a strong impression on me. As a 12-year-old kid, waking up in the middle of the night and seeing a stranger lying on the floor next to your bed is something that sticks with you. At the time, my imagination went wild with fear. I remember thinking that the man might attack us or harm us somehow. Even now, many years later, that memory still sends chills down my spine. Whenever I visit that old ranch house again, I can't help but think back to that stormy night and the moment when a flash of lightning revealed the shape of a stranger lying silently on the floor at the foot of our bed. A few years ago, something happened that I still think about from time to time. It's one of those moments that feels small when you describe it, but when you experience it yourself, the timing and the details stay with you for years. At that time in my life, my family was going through something very difficult. My uncle had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Anyone who has known someone with that illness understands how serious it can be. It is one of those diseases that often progresses quickly and leaves families with very little time to prepare for what is coming. My uncle had always been an important person in our family. Growing up, he was one of those relatives who seemed larger than life to a kid. He had a loud laugh, told long stories at family gatherings, and always seemed happy to see everyone. When we were younger, he would joke with us, tell us ridiculous stories, and make the kind of sarcastic comments that only an uncle can get away with. As the years passed and we all grew older, I started to see him less as a larger-than-life adult and more as a real person with his own struggles and worries. Still, he always had that same personality. Even when things were difficult, he tried to keep a sense of humor. When the cancer diagnosis came, it hit the entire family hard. Pancreatic cancer is known for being aggressive, and in his case, the doctors were honest about the situation. They explained that treatment might slow things down, but the chances of recovery were very small. Over the following months, we watched as the disease slowly took its toll. My uncle's energy faded. The strong, talkative man we remembered began to grow weaker. Hospital visits became more frequent. Family members started traveling back and forth to see him whenever they could. During that time, there was a strange mix of emotions within the family. There was sadness, of course, but there was also a kind of quiet acceptance. When someone is seriously ill for a long time, people slowly begin to understand what is coming, even if no one wants to say it out loud. Eventually, the doctors told my family that the end was near. By that point, my uncle was very weak and mostly resting. The family stayed close to him as much as possible during those final days. While all of this was happening, I was living in my own place, a short distance away from the rest of the family. The night my uncle passed away started like any other normal night. I went to bed at my usual time. I remember feeling tired and ready for sleep. The house was quiet, and nothing unusual seemed to be happening. At some point during the night, though, something suddenly woke me up. It was a loud crashing sound. The noise was so sudden and sharp that it pulled me straight out of sleep. When you wake up suddenly like that, it can take a moment for your brain to catch up with what is happening. For a few seconds, I just lay there in bed, staring into the darkness and trying to figure out what had made that sound. It had definitely come from somewhere inside the house. It wasn't a small noise like something falling off a table. It was much louder than that. It sounded like something heavy had struck the wall or the window in the living room. The sound echoed through the house in a way that made my heart start racing. Before I even had time to get out of bed, my phone started ringing. The sound of the ringtone cut through the quiet of the house. I reached over and grabbed the phone from my nightstand. When I looked at the screen, I saw that it was my mom calling. Even half awake, I had a feeling that the call was about my uncle. I answered the phone. My mom's voice sounded tired and emotional. She told me that her brother had just passed away. The words hung in the air for a moment as I tried to process them. Even though we had all known that his condition was serious, hearing that he was gone still hit me hard. There is something final about that moment when someone tells you a person you care about has died. My mom and I talked for a few minutes. She explained that it had happened just moments earlier. The doctors had confirmed that he had passed away. We shared a quiet moment on the phone, both of us trying to deal with the sadness of the news. Eventually, the call ended. When I set the phone down, I suddenly remembered the loud crashing sound that had woken me up just before the phone rang. The house was quiet again, but now curiosity and concern pushed me to get out of bed and see what had happened. I walked slowly down the hallway toward the living room. The lights were still off, and the house felt strangely still. When I stepped into the living room, I immediately saw what had caused the noise. One of the windows had been shattered. Pieces of broken glass were scattered across the floor. Lying in the middle of the room was a large stone. It looked like someone had picked up a heavy rock from outside and thrown it straight through the window. For a moment, I just stood there staring at it. The situation made no sense. It was around 4 in the morning. The neighborhood was quiet. No one was outside, and someone had apparently thrown a large stone through my living room window. What made the moment feel even stranger was the timing. The crash had happened at almost the exact same moment my uncle died. I couldn't stop thinking about that connection. On one hand, the explanation could be simple. Maybe someone walking by had thrown the rock as a prank. Maybe it had been kids messing around late at night. Or maybe it was just some random act that happened to occur at the same time. But the coincidence was hard to ignore. But the crash had woken me up at almost the exact moment the phone call came, and that phone call carried the news that my uncle had just passed away. Standing there in the quiet living room, looking at the broken window and the stone on the floor, I felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was sadness for my uncle. There was confusion about who had thrown the rock, and there was a lingering feeling that the moment carried some kind of meaning I couldn't fully explain. Over the years, I've thought about that night many times. Logically, I know that the two events could simply be unrelated. Coincidences happen all the time in life. But sometimes when things happen at exactly the same moment, it's difficult not to wonder if there might be something more behind it. That night, at 4 in the morning, just as my uncle's life came to an end, a loud crash shattered the quiet of my house and woke me up. Then moments later, the phone rang with the news. Even now, years later, the memory of that timing still feels strange. Not necessarily frightening, just mysterious. One of those moments where life and coincidence seem to overlap in a way that leaves you thinking about it long after it's over. A few years ago, a friend of mine told me a story that stuck with me for a long time. It wasn't something that happened to me personally, but hearing him describe it in detail made it feel almost like I had been there with him. He isn't the type of person who usually exaggerates things either, so the way he explained everything made the whole situation feel even stranger. At the time, both of us worked at the same local grocery store. It wasn't a big chain store or anything fancy. It was one of those medium-sized neighborhood grocery stores that had been around for years. Most of the people who shopped there were regulars who lived nearby, and the employees all knew each other pretty well. What made the building interesting, though, was its history. Before it was turned into a grocery store, the building had actually been a hospital many decades earlier. The hospital had closed down a long time ago, and eventually the property was renovated and converted into a grocery store. From the outside, you wouldn't really guess that it used to be a hospital. The exterior had been updated, the signs were changed, and most of the original hospital look had been covered up. But inside, if you paid attention, you could still see pieces of the old structure. Certain hallways were a little too narrow and long for a typical grocery store. Some of the back rooms had layouts that didn't make much sense for a modern retail space. There were thick doors, old tiled floors in certain areas, and rooms that felt more like medical storage spaces than places where food should be kept. Even the employees sometimes joked about it. People would say things like, "This place still feels like a hospital." Most of the time it was just casual conversation or joking around during slow shifts. Still, working there late at night could feel a little eerie. During the day, the store was busy and full of people. Customers walked through the aisles, carts rattled across the floor, and the place felt lively. But late at night, when the store was about to close, everything changed. Once the customers left and most of the employees went home, the building became extremely quiet. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The long aisles seemed darker and emptier than usual. Every little sound echoed in the distance. My friend had recently been promoted to a manager position at the store, which meant that sometimes he had to handle the closing shift. Now, closing the store wasn't exactly a fun job. You had to make sure every aisle was clear, every door was locked, the registers were closed, and all the lights were turned off in the back areas. The last manager on duty usually walked through the entire building before leaving. One particular night, he was the only employee left in the store. Everyone else had clocked out and gone home, and he stayed behind to finish the final closing tasks. According to him, the back storage area of the store was already creepy enough even during the day. The back rooms were located where the hospital's supply areas used to be. The walls were thick, the hallways were narrow, and there were several heavy doors that separated the rooms. In those back areas, the store kept extra stock, cleaning supplies, and large walk-in freezers where frozen foods were stored. Being back there alone at night made the place feel even more unsettling. That night, my friend was doing his usual closing routine. He had already locked the front doors and made sure no customers were still in the building. After that, he went to the back area to turn off lights and lock the storage rooms and freezer doors. He moved through the storage area one room at a time, switching off lights and checking locks. Eventually, he reached the area where the large freezer was located. Right outside the freezer was a cart used for storing watermelons during the day. The cart was painted a very bright yellow color, almost neon yellow. because the paint was so glossy and bright. The surface sometimes reflected shapes and movement like a blurry mirror. It wasn't a perfect reflection, but you could still see vague shapes moving across it. My friend was standing in that area finishing up his closing checklist when he noticed something strange. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the reflection on the yellow cart suddenly change. The reflection was blocked by something. It looked as if someone had walked behind him, interrupting the light that normally bounced off the cart. Naturally, his first thought was that someone else had come into the back area. Maybe one of the employees had forgotten something and returned. Or maybe a customer had somehow wandered back there without him noticing, so he turned around to look. But when he looked behind him, there was no one there. The hallway behind him was empty. At first, he thought maybe someone had quickly stepped out of sight or walked back toward the main store area. So he opened the door that led back into the store's aisles. The aisles were completely empty. No employees, no customers, just rows of shelves and the quiet hum of the store's refrigeration units. For a moment he stood there looking around, trying to convince himself that maybe the reflection had just been a trick of the light. Maybe the overhead lights had flickered slightly. Maybe he had imagined the movement. So he turned around and continued walking through the store towards the front. He had only taken a few steps down the aisle when he heard a loud noise from behind him. It sounded like banging. The sound was coming from the freezer, the same freezer he had just finished locking. The banging was loud and heavy, like something striking the metal door from the inside. He stopped walking immediately. The store was completely silent except for that noise. The banging happened again. At that moment, his mind started racing with possible explanations. Maybe someone had somehow gotten trapped inside the freezer. Maybe an employee had been inside and he didn't realize it when he locked the door. Even though the idea scared him, he knew he had to check. So he walked quickly back to the freezer door. The banging had stopped by the time he reached it. He stood there for a second, listening carefully. Nothing, just silence. Slowly he unlocked the freezer door and pulled it open. Cold air rushed out immediately. Inside the freezer, everything looked normal. Rows of frozen food boxes were stacked on metal shelves. The lights inside the freezer flickered slightly, the way they always did. But there was no one there. No employee, no trapped person, nothing. Just cold air and silence. At that moment, my friend decided he had seen enough for the night. He said he didn't even bother locking the freezer door again. He simply turned around, walked straight out of the back area, grabbed his things, and left the building as quickly as possible. According to him, he didn't stop walking until he was outside in the parking lot. Even now, when he talks about that night, he still shakes his head and laughs nervously. He always finishes the story with the same comment. Old hospitals, man. Whether the sounds and reflections had some normal explanation or not, that experience was enough to convince him that closing the store alone at night was something he would rather avoid whenever possible. One winter night a few years ago, I left a small party at a friend's house that was located far out in the countryside. The house sat miles away from the nearest city, surrounded by long stretches of empty road, open land, and scattered trees. It was the kind of place where the nights felt especially dark because there were almost no streetlights or nearby buildings to break the darkness. The party itself had been relaxed and friendly. It wasn't loud or chaotic like some parties can be. It was mostly a group of friends hanging out together, talking, listening to music, and enjoying the quiet comfort of being around people we trusted. The house was warm inside, with lights glowing in the windows, laughter echoing through the rooms, and the occasional sound of someone opening another drink or telling a funny story. I had been there for several hours, probably close to 6 in total. During that time, I had a couple of drinks, but nothing close to enough to make me drunk. I felt completely clear-headed. If anything, I was just in a good mood, relaxed and happy from spending time with friends. Eventually, the night started winding down. Some people were talking about staying longer, but I had a bit of a drive ahead of me. My home was back in the city, about 20 miles away from where the house was located. Because the house was out in the country, the drive back involved long, quiet roads with almost no traffic. I decided it was time for me to leave. As I stepped outside, the cold winter air hit me immediately. It was one of those clear winter nights where the sky looks black and endless, and the cold feels sharp in your lungs when you breathe. See, the driveway was dimly lit by a porch light, but beyond that, everything faded into darkness. My car was parked near the edge of the driveway. I walked over to it, unlocked the door, and got inside. At that moment, nothing felt unusual at all. I started the car, turned on the headlights, and pulled out onto the narrow road that led away from the house. The beams from the headlights cut through the darkness, lighting up the empty pavement ahead. For the first few minutes, the drive was perfectly normal. The road stretched forward between fields and small patches of woods. The sky was completely dark, and the only sounds were the engine of my car and the faint noise of the tires rolling over the road. Then something changed. It's hard to describe exactly when the feeling started. It wasn't caused by a sound or something I saw. It was more like a sudden awareness, a deep instinct that something wasn't right. Out of nowhere, a powerful feeling came over me. I wasn't alone in the car. There was someone in the back seat. The thought hit me so suddenly and so strongly that my entire body reacted before my mind had time to question it. My hands tightened on the steering wheel and my heart began to pound harder. At first, I tried to reason with myself. I told myself that it was impossible. I had been the first person to leave the party. No one else had come outside while I was getting into my car. I had unlocked the door, sat down, and started driving right away. There had been no chance for anyone to sneak into the back seat. But the feeling refused to go away. Instead, it grew stronger. It felt as if someone was sitting directly behind me, but close enough that I could almost sense their presence. The air inside the car felt heavier somehow, like the space had changed. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, gripping the steering wheel tighter and tighter. The rear view mirror hung above the windshield like it always did, offering a perfect reflection of the back seat. All I had to do was glance up. Just one quick look and I would know for sure whether someone was back there or not. But I couldn't do it. Something deep inside me refused to let me look. The fear that filled my chest was so intense that it almost paralyzed me. I had the overwhelming feeling that if I looked into that mirror, I would see something I could never forget, something I didn't want to see. So instead of looking, I kept driving. The road stretched on through the darkness mile after mile, where every second felt longer than it should have. The silence inside the car seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest, in my neck, even in my hands on the steering wheel. My mind kept racing through possibilities. Maybe someone had climbed into the back seat when I wasn't paying attention. Maybe one of the other guests had decided to play a prank. Maybe someone was hiding there, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. But even those explanations didn't fully match the feeling I had. The presence behind me felt too still, too quiet. If someone was sitting back there, they weren't moving or speaking at all. The entire drive home felt endless. Every small sound made me jump slightly. The noise of the car shifting gears, the wind brushing against the windows, even the faint creak of the seats as I moved. All the while, I kept my eyes locked on the road ahead, refusing to glance at the mirror. Eventually, the familiar lights of the city began to appear in the distance. Streetlights replaced the darkness of the countryside, and houses began to line the roads again. Seeing those lights brought a small wave of relief. I wasn't out in the middle of nowhere anymore. I finally reached my neighborhood and turned onto my street. My house stood quietly at the end of the driveway, exactly as it always did. I pulled the car into the driveway and parked. For a moment, I just sat there. The engine was still running, and the headlights illuminated the front of the house. Everything looked normal and peaceful, but I still hadn't looked in the rearview mirror. I turned off the car. The engine went silent. The sudden quiet inside the vehicle felt almost overwhelming. I sat there in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead, afraid to move. A few seconds passed, but those seconds felt like an eternity. Then something happened. From behind me, I heard and felt the back passenger side door open. The sound was unmistakable. The handle moved, the door swung outward, and cold air rushed briefly into the car. Then the door closed again, just like that. My entire body tensed. For a split second, I was convinced that this was the moment something terrible would happen. I truly believed that whoever had been sitting behind me was about to attack. But nothing happened. No one grabbed me, no voice spoke, no footsteps approached. The car remained silent. I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to calm the panic that had taken over my body. Finally, and after what felt like several minutes, I opened the driver's door and stepped out. The night air felt incredibly cold against my skin, but it also felt strangely comforting. I quickly walked toward the front door of my house and went inside. The moment I closed the door behind me, a huge wave of relief washed over me. My legs felt weak, like they might give out at any moment. I stood there in the quiet of my home, trying to process what had just happened. To this day, I still don't know who or what was in the back seat of my car that night. Maybe it was a person who somehow slipped into the car without me noticing. Maybe it was someone who simply opened the door and left once we reached my house. Or maybe it was something else entirely. All I know is that during that drive home through the dark countryside, I felt a presence behind me so strongly that I couldn't even bring myself to look in the mirror. And when I finally stopped the car in my own driveway, the back door opened and closed, as if someone had quietly stepped out and disappeared into the night. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments, and in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.